Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into it, looking at those crucial years, 1763 to 1775, right before the American War for Independence.
Yeah, it's that period where things really start to unravel or maybe come together, depending on your perspective.
Exactly. And our mission today is to look at the sources and figure out how these colonists, who are, pretty proud to be British subjects initially, ended up deciding to break away.
It's quite the shift, isn't it? Because our sources are clear. Mid-18th century, the colonies are like deeply integrated into the British Empire.
They really saw themselves as British.
Absolutely. And honestly, they were doing pretty well by global standards back then. A high standard of living, relatively speaking.
Yeah, this sources mention access to affordable British goods, lots of consumer choice, and critically, way more opportunity to actually own land compared to back in Europe.
Definitely. So it wasn't like they were starting from a place of just, abject misery driving revolution. Far from it.
Which brings us to this idea of salutary neglect. It's a key concept for this period, right?
Oh, definitely. It basically covers that stretch, maybe 1713 to 1763 or so, where Britain was much more hands-off with the colonies.
Okay, so salutary neglect. The idea from Prime Minister Walpole was kind of let them be, they'll make more money for us, and cause less trouble.
That's the gist of it, yeah. Britain had its own things going on, wars in Europe, other priorities. Yeah. So they kind of provided the basics, protection, trade rules, encouraged people to move there.
Right, saw them as future customers, essentially.
Exactly. Minimal interference. And the result was, well, the colonies got used to it.
They developed this sense of self-reliance, organizing their own militias, setting up their own colonial governments, 13 of them.
And those governments often pushed back a bit against Parliament. Even then, they were definitely more responsive to what people needed locally.
So Americans got accustomed to managing their own affairs.
Yeah, and you even see American manufacturing starting to grow, despite British rules trying to limit it. Merchants got wealthier, trade networks flourished, sometimes, let's say, unofficially. Smuggling was pretty rampant because enforcement was lax.
Huh, right. So this period of autonomy wasn't just economic, it was political too. They got used to running the show themselves.
Which made it a real shock later when Britain tried to tighten the reins. It felt like an intrusion.
Okay, so that's the neglect part. Now, what about the ideas floating around? Our sources talk about Whig ideology being influential.
Yes. Whig ideology, the core idea there, and you see this in the sources, is a real suspicion of concentrated power.
Like power corrupts.
Pretty much. They believed you needed a balanced government with checks on the king's power to prevent tyranny. It was all about limiting authority.
And the Whigs had already had success with this in England after the Glorious Revolution, establishing Parliament's power. So it wasn't just theory for the colonists.
Exactly. They saw it as a model, a way to understand their own rights and, maybe more importantly, potential threats to those rights. It gave them a language, a framework, to critique British actions later on.
So they were primed to be suspicious of anything that looked like government overreach.
Highly sensitive to it, yeah.
Now, while all this is happening with Britain, things weren't perfectly harmonious within the colonies either, were they? The sources mention internal tensions.
That's a really important point. It wasn't some unified paradise suddenly disrupted by Britain. There were deep divisions. You see these sometimes violent protests by Western settlers against the Eastern elites.
Like the Regulator Movement, North Carolina, 1771.
Exactly. Farmers in the West protesting taxes, lack of representation, feeling like the laws favored the rich planters in the East.
And it led to actual fighting, right? The Battle of Alamance, colonial militia against these regulators.
It did. Shows that there was already a willingness to challenge authority, even colonial authority, before the conflict with Britain really kicked off.
And wasn't there something similar in Pennsylvania? The Paxton Boys.
Yeah, 1764. Scots-Irish settlers on the frontier, furious with the Quaker government in Philadelphia for being, in their view, too lenient towards Native Americans after attacks.
It got ugly, didn't it? They attacked peaceful Native Americans.
Horrifically so. Killed 20 neutral Conestoga Indians. Then they marched on Philadelphia demanding more protection, more representation, funding for infrastructure out west.
Wow. So these internal conflicts, they kind of echo earlier rebellions too, like Bacon's Rebellion back in the 17th century, a pattern of internal friction.
Absolutely. And while these weren't about independence from Britain, they show this tradition of demanding rights, challenging perceived injustices, using direct action sometimes. That energy, that mindset, it gets redirected towards Britain later.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop. Self-governance, suspicion of power, internal squabbles. Let's bring in the economic system, mercantilism. What was the basic idea?
Mercantilism, at its core, was the belief that colonies exist for one primary reason: to make the mother country richer and more self-sufficient.
So the colonies are basically resources, economic engines for Britain.
Pretty much. Enhance the empire's wealth, provide raw materials, buy British goods. That was the deal, from London's perspective.
Colonists as tenants almost, expected to produce things like tobacco, timber, fur, and not cause too much trouble or compete with British industries.
Exactly. They were vital for naval power ships, supplies, sailors. They were a huge market for British manufactured goods. And they helped keep gold and silver in the empire by producing valuable cash crops that Britain could sell elsewhere.
And the tools to enforce this system were the navigation laws. What did they do specifically?
Well, they evolved over time, starting back in the 1650s, partly to muscle out the Dutch shippers. But the main rules were things like colonial trade had to be on English or, later, American ships. Certain valuable goods, they called them enumerated goods, like tobacco, sugar, cotton, could only be shipped to England first, even if they could get a better price somewhere else.
Ah, so Britain gets the first cut, handles the re-export.
Right. And European goods going to America had to go through England first, too, duties paid there. Plus, restrictions on the colonies making things that would compete with British manufacturing, like woolen cloth or hats.
So raw materials good, finished goods bad, basically.
They encouraged things like producing pig iron, but clamped down on making finished steel products, for example.
And the Molasses Act, 1733, that sounds specific.
It was. It put high taxes on molasses, rum, and sugar coming from anywhere but the British West Indies. This was a big deal because the mainland colonies traded a lot with the French Caribbean,
Right, molasses was key for making rum.
and the rum trade was tangled up with the slave trade. So that act really aimed to channel profits within the empire, but it was widely smuggled around.
Okay, so this whole mercantilist system, the sources say it wasn't all bad for the colonists, at least initially.
That's true, especially before 1763. The laws weren't always strictly enforced, that whole salutary neglect thing. And colonists still had, the rights of Englishmen, significant self-government in practice.
Plus, free military protection from the British Army and Navy.
A huge benefit. And they did make good money from trade and even some manufacturing. Despite the restrictions, they found ways to prosper within the system.
But there were definite downsides. The economy probably didn't develop as fast as it might have otherwise, especially manufacturing.
For sure. And the southern colonies really depended on those enumerated crops like tobacco, were hit hard when prices dropped in London. That could cause serious unrest, maybe even fueling things like Bacon's Rebellion earlier on.
And you mentioned resentment in New England, feeling like Britain favored the southern planters.
Yeah, a sense that the system was rigged towards certain crops, and then there were the writs of assistance.
Ah, the general search warrants to crack down on smuggling.
Exactly. Super controversial. James Otis arguing against them in 1761 is a landmark moment. He framed it as a fundamental violation of rights. That's where you really hear that no taxation without representation ideas start to bubble up forcefully.
Okay, so the system is creaking a bit, resentment is building, and then comes the big shift. Salutary neglect ends around 1763. What happens?
Well, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War to the colonists, ends. Britain wins, huge territory gained, but also massive debt.
Right, and they look at the colonies, which they just spent a fortune defending, and think,
It's time they paid their fair share for that defense. George Grenville becomes prime minister, and he's determined to enforce the Navigation Acts properly, collect the duties.
so no more looking the other way.
Nope. And they expand the power of admiralty courts with no juries to handle smuggling cases, moves them to Nova Scotia, far away. Americans were furious about that, saw it as bypassing their right to a jury trial.
And you also have a new king, George III. The sources describe him as maybe a bit stubborn, wanting more direct control.
Yeah, he seems less inclined towards the Whig approach of letting Parliament run things and more towards asserting royal authority. Plus, his advisors were maybe less experienced, less politically savvy than Walpole's generation. The whole political climate in London shifts.
And this leads to specific policies that really antagonize the colonists. First up, the Proclamation of 1763.
Right. Basically draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains and tells colonists, don't settle west of this.
Why?
To avoid more conflict with Native Americans, like Pontiac's Rebellion, which was happening right then. Cheaper than fighting more wars. But colonists, especially those who fought in the war and land speculators, felt they'd earned the right to that western land.
So they saw it as Britain blocking their future.
Pretty much. They largely ignored it, but the resentment was real.
Okay, then the Currency Act, 1764. What was that about?
Trying to control colonial paper money. Colonies were printing their own money, often not backed by much, leading to inflation. Britain wanted debts and taxes paid in hard currency, gold and silver, which the colonies didn't have much of.
Because of the trade deficit with Britain, right? Money flowed out.
Exactly. So this act just made their cash shortage worse, led to more bartering, economic problems.
And then the Sugar Act, also 1764. This one's important, isn't it?
Hugely important, because it was the first law Parliament passed, specifically stating its purpose was to raise revenue from the colonies.
Not just regulating trade, but actually taxing them for income.
Precisely. Technically, it lowered the tax on foreign molasses compared to the old Molasses Act, but it also taxed more items and, crucially, aimed for stricter enforcement. The purpose had changed. That was a red flag for the colonists.
And then the Quartering Act in 1765.
Yeah, requiring certain colonies to provide housing and supplies for British troops stationed there, another financial burden, and seen as an imposition.
So by 1765, the whole relationship has shifted. No more neglect. Britain is actively intervening, taxing, regulating in ways they hadn't before.
The stage is definitely set. And this leads us into what our sources call the three big crises that really push things over the edge. Stamp Act, Townshend Act, Tea Act.
Right. Let's start with the Stamp Act, 1765. Our source calls it maybe the single most important event leading to the revolution. Why was it such a big deal?
It was a direct internal tax. Not a duty on trade at the ports, but a tax on things used inside the colonies.
On what kind of things?
All sorts of paper goods, newspapers, pamphlets, almanacs, legal documents, wills, deeds, diplomas, dice, playing cards, marriage licenses. It hit a huge range of people, especially lawyers, merchants, printers, tavern owners, influential people.
And Grenville's justification was?
Fair share. He argued colonists needed to contribute to the cost of their own defense, pointed out that people in Britain paid a similar, often higher stamp tax, seemed reasonable from London.
But the colonial reaction was not reasonable.
Not from Grenville's view. It was immediate and fierce. You get the Virginia Resolves, pushed by Patrick Henry.
That's the no taxation without representation cry.
But that becomes the rallying cry. The argument was fundamental. As Englishmen, they had a right not to be taxed except by their own elected representatives, and they didn't elect anyone to Parliament.
They drew this line, didn't they, between Parliament regulating trade external stuff, which they didn't love but kind of accepted, and Parliament imposing internal taxes just to raise money.
Exactly. That distinction was crucial for them. Internal taxes without their consent were seen as tyranny, a violation of their property rights and liberty.
And they rejected the British idea of virtual representation, the idea that Parliament represented all British subjects, even those who couldn't vote.
Completely rejected it. They argued their interests were too different, too far removed. And interestingly, they didn't actually want seats in Parliament. They knew they'd be a tiny minority, easily outvoted, and probably taxed even more. They wanted their own assemblies to hold the power of the purse.
So what did they do about the Stamp Act?
They organized, for the first time, really, on a large scale across colonies. The Stamp Act Congress met in 1765. 9 colonies sent delegates. They petitioned the king and parliament to repeal the act. Huge step in intercolonial cooperation.
And boycotts, non-importation agreements.
Yes, those were really effective. Colonists refused to buy British goods, hurt British merchants and manufacturers badly, and you had groups like the Sons of Liberty emerge.
They were more direct action.
Yeah. They used intimidation, sometimes violence, to force stamp distributors to resign. They enforced the boycotts, made sure the stamps couldn't actually be sold or used. It was a combination of high-minded legal arguments and street-level resistance.
And it worked, right. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act.
They did in 1766, mostly because of the economic pressure from British merchants losing business. Big victory for the colonists.
But there's a catch.
Always a catch. At the same time they repealed it, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, basically saying, okay, we're taking this tax back, but just so you know, we absolutely do have the right to tax you and make laws for you in all cases whatsoever.
So they backed down on the tax, but doubled down on the principle.
Exactly. The core issue wasn't resolved at all. Oh, and they also reduced the Sugar Act tax around the same time, trying to smooth things over a bit.
Okay, so a temporary calm, maybe, but the underlying conflict is still there, which leads to the Townshend Acts, 1767.
Yep. Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, tries a different approach. New import duties, technically external taxes on things like glass, lead, paper, paint, silk, and crucially tea.
But the colonists saw through that, didn't they? The revenue was specifically earmarked to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges in the colonies.
That was the key. Made those officials independent of the colonial assemblies who used to control their salaries. Colonists saw it as another attempt to raise revenue without consent and undermine their own governments, regardless of whether the tax was collected at the port or not.
And John Dickinson's letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania were important here.
Very influential. He argued forcefully that the purpose of the tax mattered, not whether it was internal or external. If it was for revenue, it was unconstitutional without consent. Really solidified opposition.
What was the reaction this time?
Similar pattern. Massachusetts sends out a circular letter urging other colonies to petition for repeal. Britain reacts angrily, orders the Massachusetts Assembly dissolved if they don't rescind it, tells other governors to dissolve any assemblies that support it.
Heavy-handed again.
Very. It just made things worse. Led to more non-importation agreements, boycotts. Several assemblies were dissolved. And Britain sent more troops, particularly to Boston, which was seen as the hotbed of resistance.
Which leads directly to the Boston Massacre in 1770.
Right. Tensions sky high. A confrontation between soldiers and a crowd of Bostonians, snowballs, insults, confusion, and shots fired. And 5 colonists killed.
And the propaganda machine kicked in.
Oh, yeah. Paul Revere's famous engraving, Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty, they portrayed it as a deliberate slaughter of innocents by tyrannical troops. Hugely effective in turning public opinion against the British, even though the soldiers were actually defended by John Adams and mostly acquitted or lightly punished.
So more pressure. Did Parliament back down again?
Partially. In 1770, facing the economic boycott again, they repealed most of the Townshend duties: glass, lead, paper, paint. But
They kept the tax on tea.
they kept the tax on tea. Just a small tax, 3 pence per pound, but it was purely symbolic. To maintain that principle asserted in the Declaratory Act, Parliament can tax the colonies.
So another brief lull, maybe, but the core problem persists. Any other incidents in this period?
Well, you had the Gaspee Affair in 1771. Colonists in Rhode Island attacked and burned a British customs schooner that had run aground. Showed tensions were still simmering.
And Samuel Adams was busy organizing.
Yes, he set up the committees of correspondence, starting in Massachusetts in 1772. These were crucial. They spread information, coordinated resistance efforts, kept the opposition alive between crises, really built an intercolonial network, became the backbone of future Congresses.
Okay, which brings us to the third major crisis, the Tea Act of 1773. This one seems almost accidental in its consequences.
Kind of. It wasn't intended to provoke the colonies like the Stamp Act or Townshend Acts. It was actually designed to bail out the struggling British East India Company
How?
by giving it a monopoly on selling tea directly in the colonies. They could bypass middlemen, even undercut the price of smuggled Dutch tea, despite the small Townshend tea tax still being in effect.
So, cheaper tea for the colonists, what's not to like?
Huh. Well, the colonists saw it as a trick. A clever way to get them to accept the principle of parliamentary taxation by buying the cheaper taxed tea. It wasn't about the price, it was about the principle. Buying the tea meant acknowledging Parliament's right to tax them.
So they weren't falling for it.
Not at all. Resistance flared up everywhere. Ships were turned away in some ports. And in Boston.
December 16, 1773, the Boston Tea Party.
Yep. Sons of Liberty, thinly disguised as Native Americans, boarded the ships and dumped about 342 chests of tea into the harbor. A massive amount, a huge financial loss for the East India Company.
And Britain's reaction this time? No more backing down.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Uh-huh.
Parliament was furious. They passed a series of laws in 1774, known collectively as the Coercive Acts, or, as the colonists called them, the Intolerable Acts.
Aimed squarely at punishing Massachusetts, right?
Absolutely. The Boston Port Act closed the harbor until the tea was paid for. Devastating economically. Another act basically revoked key parts of the Massachusetts Charter, giving the royal governor much more power, restricting town meetings.
What else?
The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of capital crimes, while performing their duties, to be sent to Britain for trial. Colonists called it the Murder Act, thinking they'd get off easy. And a new, stricter quartering act applied to all colonies.
And at the same time, the Quebec Act, that wasn't technically part of the punishment, but it got lumped in.
It did. It dealt with governing the territory won from France. It extended Quebec's boundaries south into the Ohio Valley land, some colonies claimed. It also granted religious tolerance to French Catholics.
Which didn't go down well in largely Protestant New England and elsewhere.
Not at all. They saw it as promoting Catholicism, boxing them in geographically, and setting a precedent for non-representative government on their borders. It fueled paranoia.
So the Intolerable Acts plus the Quebec Act, this was the final straw.
Pretty much galvanized everyone. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, it united the colonies in outrage. The committees of correspondence went into overdrive, calling for a meeting.
The First Continental Congress, Philadelphia, September 1774.
Right. Delegates from 12 colonies Georgia held out initially. This was a huge step. They didn't declare independence, but they strongly condemned the Intolerable Acts.
What did they decide to do?
They endorsed the Suffolk Resolves for Massachusetts, which called the Intolerable Acts unconstitutional and urged citizens to arm themselves and boycott British goods. They rejected a plan for reconciliation that involves a colonial union under British authority. They issued a declaration and resolves, lifting their grievances, but still professing loyalty to the king. And crucially, they created the association.
What was the association?
A coordinated plan for a complete boycott, non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption of British goods, with local committees to enforce it. Really put teeth into the resistance.
But still hoping for reconciliation, still loyal to George III.
Officially, yes. The declaration was addressed to the king, hoping he'd intervene against Parliament. But the mood was hardening. Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death" speech came just a few months later, March 1775.
And did the king or Parliament respond to the Congress's petition?
Nope. Ignored it. They saw the Congress as an illegal assembly and were determined to assert British authority, by force if necessary.
Which leads us directly to April 1775, Lexington and Concord.
The breaking point. British troops marched out from Boston to seize colonial military supplies stored at Concord and possibly arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock.
Paul Revere's ride.
And William Dawes and others. The alarm was spread. Minutemen gathered on Lexington Green. Shots were fired. Who fired first is still debated.
The shot heard around the world.
Exactly. Fighting ensued at Lexington, then more at Concord Bridge. The British found few supplies and had a brutal march back to Boston, harassed by colonial militia, firing from behind walls and trees the whole way. Heavy casualties for the British.
And Boston ends up under siege by colonial militia. War has begun.
Armed conflict is underway, even if independence hasn't been declared yet.
So as things kick off, let's quickly look at the balance sheet. Strengths and weaknesses for both sides. Britain first.
Okay, Britain. Strengths. Huge population advantage, massive wealth, the world's best navy, a professional, well-trained army, plus those Hessian mercenaries. Support from loyalists within the colonies, some Native American tribes, and promises of freedom drew some enslaved people to their side.
Weaknesses.
Distance was huge. Hard to supply and command an army across the Atlantic. America itself was vast, difficult to occupy and control. Leadership, both military and political, back in London was often questionable. Not everyone in Britain supported the war, and they always had to worry about France jumping in.
Okay, the Americans. Strength.
Outstanding leadership, eventually. Washington, Franklin, Adams. Crucial foreign aid, especially from France later on. Fighting defensively on home turf they knew well. They were largely self-sufficient agriculturally. Good marksmen, many colonists were familiar with firearms, and a strong belief in the justice of their cause, the moral advantage.
And their weaknesses.
Pretty significant. Badly organized initially. Lack of unity, lots of jealousy between colonies. The Continental Congress was weak, lacked real power to tax or raise an army effectively. Major economic problems, printing worthless paper money, debt, constant shortages of supplies, guns, gunpowder, food, clothing. The militia was unreliable for long campaigns, and not everyone was committed. Maybe only a third actively supported the patriot cause, a third were loyalist, a third neutral. Profiteering was also a problem.
Quite the list on both sides. It really wasn't a foregone conclusion at all.
Not by any stretch.
Yep.
So, considering all that, this whole tangled web, salutary neglect, creating expectations, Whig ideas about liberty, mercantilist friction, the internal colonial tensions, and then these specific crises, Stamp Act, Townsend Acts, Tea Act, Intolerable Acts.
Yeah.
It's complex.
It really is. So thinking about everything we've discussed, all those factors intertwine them over decades. Here's something for you, the listener, to consider. If you had to pick one single factor, maybe a long-term trend, an ideology, an economic pressure, or a specific event, what do you think was ultimately the most decisive thing that pushed those colonies, once proud to be British, into open war? It's a question that really gets to the heart of how this all happened.